Welcome to today's Paperclip Communications webinar. Today's presentation may not be reproduced or recorded without permission from Paperclip Communications and its presenters. This webinar and all materials provided during the presentation may not be altered. This presentation is not intended as legal advice and should be considered general information only. The answers to legal questions generally hinge upon the specific facts and circumstances of an institution. Individuals with specific questions should contact their institution's legal counsel. The opinions expressed during today's event are not necessarily those of Paperclip Communications. Welcome, everyone. My name is Laura Betty, and I will be your moderator for today. On behalf of Paperclip Communications, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for today's webinar entitled Racial Battle Fatigue: Shift Your Campus Culture to Better Support Students, Faculty, and Staff of Color. Before we get started, let's go over a few things you need to know. Audio should be streaming automatically through your browser. You can click the megaphone icon in the application bar at the top of your screen to mute or unmute the audio. If you have not yet downloaded the webinar handouts and materials for today's presentation, you may download the files from the materials panel on the left side of your screen. We will have a Q&A following the presentation. At any point during the presentation, feel free to ask a question or write a comment in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. This gives us the opportunity to have some back and forth with our audience throughout our conversation. Also, be sure to join the conversation on social media via the links in the lower left of your screen. One last thing before I introduce our presenters. You definitely want to print out the RBF handout document we provided to you prior to the webinar, if you haven't done so already. It's a large packet and it's chock full of unbelievable resources, but also our presenters will be referencing it today throughout the webinar. You also may want to make sure to print out the debrief handout that we provided so you can have some reflective conversation after the webinar. To begin our webinar, I would like to introduce our expert presenters who have so graciously agreed to contribute their professional experience and wisdom with us today. Dr. Tanya Williams is the lead consultant for Authentic Coaching and Consulting. Tanya, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure thing, Laura. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be on the webinar and to be in conversation with Cathy about racial battle fatigue and creating campuses that are safer and more comfortable for marginalized groups and people of color. I've been working in higher education. I worked in higher education 20 years prior to moving to full-time consulting and coaching. And having worked in predominantly white spaces and predominantly white institutions during my career in higher education, racial battle fatigue most definitely is something that I experienced and faced and was a reality in my everyday work life. Having to navigate white cultural norms, ignorance, administration with relatively low competence around dynamics of racial oppression really took its toll on me. And my hope for today's webinar is to have all racial groups represented in our participation and participants to walk away with tools and opportunities for reflection to lessen the impact of racial oppression and racial battle fatigue. I want to let folks know that I am based in New York City today, and you might hear an ambulance fly by my window, and so don't worry, I'm absolutely fine. It sounds of the city.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Our second presenter is Dr. Cathy OBerry, the co-founder of the Social Justice Training Institute and an expert at training leaders and facilitators to navigate difficult dialogues and triggering events. Cathy, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hello, I too am honored to be with you all, and Tanya, so grateful to partner with you on this. And I'm missing New York City. I'm having a little homesickness because I live in Denver now. So folks may hear the dogs in the dog park just outside the window. And you know, Tanya, when you were talking about the impact of racism and racial battle fatigue on you, when I worked in higher ed, I was a well-intended white person, and I would have had no clue that was occurring for you or any other of my colleagues of color, much less the students of color on campus. Because I thought all I needed to do was be friendly, be personable, say hello, not say anything that I thought was racist. Doesn't mean I didn't, but it's like I didn't know it. And I thought that was enough. And as I look back, I wasn't talking about race and race dynamics. I attended a few workshops, but I wasn't understanding white privilege or white culture or internalized dominance, what whites do every day that perpetuates dynamics that result in racial battle fatigue. So I didn't see the chilly, hostile climates for folks of color and folks who are multiracial, biracial. And I didn't recognize my role in what I was doing to create and maintain the status quo, which really impacted and still does folks of color. So it's taken years of training and self-work to begin to realize all that I need to learn and unlearn, and to, we'll see on this workshop here, but if I can show up as an effective partner to folks of color. So my hope today, particularly, is the folks of color, folks who are multiracial, biracial, find they're not alone, and that it's really about systemic racist dynamics that has to shift. And for the whites on the phone, on the webinar, to really realize our incredible responsibility and role to step up, get in the game, increase our capacity to partner and follow the leadership of folks of color, dismantle racial injustice, create racial justice in our campuses. So I've been consulting since 1987, and hopefully this workshop meets people's needs. So that's me.
Thank you so much to you both. We are really, really pleased to have Tanya and Cathy here today. Why don't you both go ahead and get started?
Thanks so much, Laura. We're going to jump in, and I'll let you know that we have a webinar that's chock full of information, and so we do encourage people to really follow along with us, and also make the time to go back after the webinar and spend some time with both the PowerPoint and the handouts on your own and in small groups on your campus. And so just to give you a framework of what we're going to be doing today, we will be sharing personal impacts and stories along the way. Of course, we want to talk about why racial battle fatigue feels impactful and important to talk about right now. And our particular framework and approach to the work is that we're providing information. We do have some moments of interactivity, opportunities for your reflection, and really come from a liberatory lens that we all have an opportunity to engage in this work and move from a space of support as opposed to blame. So what is racial battle fatigue? You'll see on the slide that it was coined by a researcher, Dr. Williams Smith. And one of the things that I really want to point out that there is, and Cathy and I both talked about it, there are the stressors and the microaggressions and insults and cultural norms that happen. And the racial battle fatigue, the fatigue itself, the anxiety, the stress, the other ills, are the outcomes of those larger systems. And so people are having to deal with the oppression, and the fatigue is the result of that. And so we really want to highlight both today and have your attention drawn to that. We want to set up that institutional culture can either help increase racial battle fatigue, or it can lessen the impact of racial battle fatigue for people. And so it's not only about individuals, but institutions can set themselves up as assisting in lessening the impact and challenging the status quo, as Cathy said, or can contribute to it. And that campuses who really want to create change and support racially marginalized groups have to commit to anti-racist behavior, policies, practices on their campus, and commit to significant culture change. So our flow today really is setting up what is racial battle fatigue, what causes it, why, and what are the outcomes of it. But then really spending some time also on, so what do you do with this? It's one thing to get the information, but it feels more effective to really move towards, so this is what we are thinking might be next steps for both campuses and individuals on those campuses. So, what causes racial battle fatigue? Clearly, systems of oppression. And I think that I'll hand that over to Cathy to talk us through that.
I'll start and just jump in as always. My guess is, Tanya, you're like me, that every campus and organization I'm getting to these days, I'm hearing more and more folks of color talking about feeling worn down, exhausted, just from the constant vigilance to have to take care of others as well as take care of themselves. And they're using so much energy, so much of their spirit to respond and resist racism and support particularly the students, the faculty, or their staff of color, as the white colleagues usually are not doing much of anything to address these dynamics. And what they're also saying to me is it's not just what's happening on campus, it's the oppressions that are also happening outside. And so the energy to survive and thrive with the systems in the society internationally as well as on campus, just those cumulative impacts, is just so depleting into racial battle fatigue. And most whites, like me for so long, unaware and clueless of the devastating impacts that are happening around us. And so it's that persistent, increasing violence that I'm noticing in the United States. The non-indictment of Ferguson was a real wake-up call for me. I know many folks, whites and particularly most folks of color, were well aware and much more awake before that. But that moment was so powerful for me. And since then, and particularly since the election in November, I've seen increasing violence in the United States that's impacting our staff, students, faculty of color, their families, their friends. The increase of hate crimes, hate speech on campuses and the media in our communities. The seemingly daily media reports of more racial profiling by police, ICE, TSA. It seemed for a while it was daily accounts of another unarmed person of color killed while interacting with police with no accountability for their actions, no indictment, no charges, and just over and over, just the re-triggering. And so it's not just what's happening today, but these moments, as we all know, re-trigger historical group trauma that may have happened in our families. And then I just have to say that last week or so was a horrible incident. A white woman was killed by a police officer. And my heart went out to the family and friends. But then I was just outraged as I watched the incredible public uproar and response, demanding change and going after that police officer in ways that did not happen for the hundreds in the last couple of years when the person who was killed was a person of color. And so the differential response, another example of that, of the oppression, I'm just kind of highlighting a few, but not looking at how drug abuse, drug addiction has been just destroying some segments of the folks of color communities. But now this year, when opioids are really destroying many white communities, again, public outcry, resources are allocated, and differential response. So these examples of racism at the systems level, the oppression, how whites get more privileges, attention, resources, folks of color ignored, overlooked, fewer resources. The normalizing of white supremacy, particularly since the election, with mainstream media having on panel people who are white supremacists, white nationalists. KKK is marching more and more without a public outcry. Standing Rock, the barrage of xenophobic races, immigration, politics. I could go on and on, because in every societal institution there is racism and oppression, whether it's healthcare, housing, environmental racism, employment, public assistance, all the voting rights rolling back that's happening. We could spend the hour and a half just talking about that. But the reality is on our campuses, I don't find whites are raising issues about racism outside and how it's impacting their colleagues, their students. We're not talking about it. And so folks of color every day have this chronic, unrelenting stress, literally when they leave in the morning, not knowing if their partners, their friends, their kids will be safe that day or be able to come home alive. And while I can say that and have some emotion, it's even hard for me to let in what it must feel like to be a person of color and know that given how racism is working at societal level today, it is unsafe and dangerous to be on our streets and to be driving. So to always have to be on guard, it's exhausting, it's stressful, racial battle fatigue. And still, our students come to class, graduate, our staff and faculty come in, do 2 and 3 jobs because the whites are not showing up And that's how oppression looks like mostly in society. Because there's little to no relief, particularly on predominantly white campuses, whether they're 4-year or 2-year. And in our communities, the daily microaggressions that folks of color are dealing with, the systemic racism, is unrelenting. And yet they're supposed to come and support the students of color to meet their needs, keep them quiet if there's a protest, to be out there in the forums, come in on nights and weekends, do more work if there's any issues to make the university look good. All of that counseling, advising, support of students of color in addition to getting their job done. While the whites, all we have to do is go in and do what's in our job description. So as we move on, the idea of, I forgot to advance the slides, I'm sorry. But our racism is the structural, institutional, it's in our culture, our ideology, and it's internalized in how whites think we're superior, better, people of color less than, and racialized, internalized oppression. So let me hand that back.
I think the way that I want to add two things. Thank you so much, Cathy, for that clarity and just, I think the energy behind it, I could feel it. The two things that it really brought up for me was all of what you talk about, and we know that the language of intersecting identities, people's identities get layered. And so I'm reflecting on the fact that there are folks of color on campuses now who received the information earlier today that trans-identified folks can't join the military and will be banned from the military. And so that's a layered identity. So they're dealing with the racial battle fatigue. And then you get new news about your other identities that get attacked all the time as well. And so it's a lot to carry. And like you said, people are still doing the work. And connected to that, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit when we do some work, some reflection around internalized subordination. Having been in the body that I'm in, a black body, for tomorrow will be 45 years, normalizing the fatigue, it has become part of my way of being. And I want to offer and challenge folks of color to notice the ways that you have normalized your fatigue and say that it's okay to not normalize it anymore. That a way to challenge it is to say, I actually deserve more in my life. I deserve more than being exhausted and carrying all of this with me all of the time. So I think you have done a wonderful job. I'll keep moving through of talking about the recent and current climate. I want to move on to organizational culture and climate and dynamics. And so on our college campuses, we really, particularly predominantly white spaces, and, you know, I think it's important to be honest and say white supremacy and white domination gets learned by all of us, and so it can be occurring in other spaces as well, that the climate is set up as an unhealthy and unsafe space because of the response and lack of skill of top leadership. And leadership really has a, to me, large responsibility of setting the norm of being willing to create spaces that are healthy for everyone, not just white students, not just white staff and faculty, but for everyone, because that is where the institution will succeed and thrive. That's when institutions will keep the brilliance of folks of color and multiracial and biracial folks on staff, on faculty, in their student population. And so if leadership is dropping the ball in following their responsibility in creating these spaces, it's not going to be created by anyone else. And so that can look like a lack of meaningful progress during their tenure in their role. And so if the institution is in the same place it was around these issues the day you started and the day you left, are you really doing enough to actually transform the campus? A lack of meaningful response to situations that happen on campus. When people step up and say, this is what this campus feels like, is the leadership ready to respond from their own competence? And I think that is key, that it's not getting someone else necessarily to give you the words, but really from your own competence and connection to understanding the issues, are you willing and able to give a meaningful response? And then sometimes those lack of meaningful responses look like knee-jerk crisis reactions and have very little, if any, follow-through. And so it really is, we've got to silence these students, we've got to silence the situation rather than recognizing it in the whole of a larger system of oppression and saying, what do we need to do to transform this on our campus? Additionally, there are white cultural practices that happen all the time on college campuses, and white culture gets normalized. I can tell a number of stories, and I'll talk about one from an institution that I worked at. This was just even about physical space. And I know that there are tons of people out there that will identify with this, but right outside my door, I was working as a director of diversity and inclusion. The walls were lined with presidents, and all of the presidents were white men. And just to come into the office every day, what kind of space gets created for people? How do people move around? How are meetings set up? Are white cultural norms set up as the thing that is only the thing that is acceptable versus really trying to look beyond what else is possible? And so thinking about the ways in which climate happens on campus. So white cultural practices are often embedded in the campus's history. And so how do we look at those and challenge those? They exist by doing nothing to change. And so once you look at it, if you don't actually move on it and transform and question some of the practices, of course the status quo is going to stay in place. What are the things that are assumed as normal or professional or the right way, or even language around an employer that says, well, this person might not be the right fit? That is all about white cultural norms. And I think institutions have to dig a little bit deeper in understanding how they are setting that up in their practices, their policies, their ways of being. And like we said, there have been examples in our own experience. I can think of, in another role, regularly going to student life meetings. And this was earlier in my career, going to student life meetings and being the only person of color in student life, like almost dodging the microaggressions that were being said across the table and aimed at me. And I would leave those meetings every week. I would leave those meetings and go back to my office, close the door, and either cry or I coped by having a really soft baseball, like Nerf bat in my office, and I would just bang that around a little bit, or I would call a colleague of color to say, hey, I'm not crazy, am I? This is going on. And so that's the fatigue, that's the things that people might not see, and then I'd have to pull it together and show back up at the next meeting or be ready for a student. And so really thinking about, like, what is the campus creating for colleagues and faculty and staff and students of color and multiracial? As I hear you, do you want to move on? Yeah, go ahead, Cathy.
As I hear you, just powerful stories. I was thinking back to how I have and can still perpetuate white cultural norms as the only right way, like we have to be fast moving and there's urgency and we don't have time to have intense dialogue, and let's just look at the facts and be analytical and no emotion and reserved. And literally yesterday afternoon, I went to a meeting, a potential new client, and I was meeting with them, and the white woman of color, man of color, and then the white man who was executive leader came in. And the chill that happened in that moment was striking to me. And what I noticed was the whole first half of the meeting, even though I was trying to warm people up, the two folks of color were quiet, hardly said a word, and when the woman of color said, she was sitting up straight, her hands in her lap, and no emotion. And I was like, huh. Well, as we kept going, and I just kind of, by the end, we started talking about New York City, and then literally she came alive. And I even said, I noticed you have a different tone, you have different, she's like, yeah. And I'm like, you could be your full self when you lived in New York City, right? And she's like, yeah. And so I just popped into my mind that first half of the meeting, as hard as I worked, the dynamics were so predictable of just this stifling white culture that if folks of color do anything that's outside the box, outside of expectations, the level of punishment and retribution is high. And I am so unaware of those dynamics even now. And I just want to reference pages 16 and 17 in the packet, 16, 17. Tanya and I put in called unproductive meeting behaviors. If you don't have it, that's all right. You can look later. But there's like 30 plus microaggressions, the ones, Tanya, you were talking about that you experience in every one of those student affairs meetings. These happen in many meetings, and they impact folks in privileged groups as well. But when you're in a marginalized identity, in this case, a person of color, since multiracial, biracial, the cumulative impact of being interrupted, having your competence questioned, people challenging the validity of your statistics, someone rolling their eyes as you're talking, you say something, no one says it, a white person says it, and all of a sudden it's the best idea. Those dynamics just really contribute to racial battle fatigue. So people are wanting some tools, having people take this handout and just start talking about, when have you experienced these? When do you see whites experiencing them? What's the impact? And how often, much more frequently, do you see them happening to people of color? And what do you imagine the impact is? And then maybe if it's a safe enough environment, space for folks of color to say, yeah, this is my experience. But that's going to take some time. And that kind of leads us into the next slide, which I remembered to push. Yeah, you're getting to know me on the webinars. I'm sorry, I'll try to pay more attention. And so you can only have that kind of honest conversation across race for people to say, in our group, here are some of the dynamics that happen and I feel triggered. I trust you didn't intend, but when you take up 3/4 of the time and people are doing side conversations while a person of color is talking, then this is the impact it has. But most organizations are not ready, in my experience, I don't know if Tanya, you've seen the difference, to have authentic dialogue across race without some significant training, group development, and work, because most are in early stages of what the slide is talking about, the multicultural organizational development, and that's on pages 22 and 23. Now, my guess is this is familiar to some people, if not the sightings of the articles of the authors, Dr. Bailey Jackson, Dr. Rita Hardiman, been around about 40 years. The idea of a 6-stage model that you can be either very exclusionary, hostile, overtly racist, or far more racially just, inclusive, and many things in between. And most campuses, as you see on the slide, are very monocultural. As Tanya talked about, the white culture is predominant, it's not even analyzed, it's just the right way. Folks of color have to fit in, or there's punishment, or they're let go, and they're just like, see, we can't find any good ones. And that's the kind of racist language that's used. Demanding assimilation. You have to fit in, you have to look a certain way. I mean, can you imagine if campuses could talk about hair and dress for folks of color across different racial identities? And that's just one example of how to look a certain way. I have colleagues of color who change their hair to have it be straight or to wear it up so that in the interview they're not coded as too racially aware and they'll be too outspoken. I could keep going, but let me move along. And so what happens in these organizations that are very early in their identity development and moving along this model is they keep hiring folks that will maintain the racist status quo. And so while they do say, I want to hire more people of color, and usually it's faculty of color only, and usually it's only black, and so they're still in the monoracial black-white binary. But they'll hire folks of color, but if they're not thinking about competencies in the way they need to, what they'll be hiring is maybe some folks of color who they think will assimilate and fit in, as you just said. They won't rock the boat, and so they might be early in their identity development. And so, yes, they will be very useful on campus in many ways, but they may not have the capacity and the competencies to really help the organization move ahead and to partner with whites. But the biggest challenge is the focus is all we have to do is hire more people of color, as opposed to we need to make sure every single hire we make has people with incredibly, at least moderate, if not advanced competencies to create racial justice and dismantle racism on campus. And that means every single white person that's hired has to be incredibly competent around this. And most campuses don't even think about having to have whites around these social justice competencies, racial justice competencies. They just assume whites, out of their racist attitudes, are competent. Folks of color under a microscope have to prove they're competent and then expected to not only have the content knowledge, but also have multicultural competencies to do all the work. And so all this is contributing to racial battle fatigue, to that chilly, hostile climate. Now, again, it might be in microclimates and pockets, but usually if it's in pockets, there's a general, overall, very low development of the organization. And yes, we need to address the microaggressions, but as we keep talking, it's the systems change that we need to be doing in hiring, onboarding, supervision, promotion, tenure. Because without, as you said earlier, intentional intervention to create sustainable, meaningful systems change, nothing's going to change. There'll be these harried, urgent reactions to crises. We're back to the status quo, and all the folks of color will have their expectations a little, maybe this time will be different, crushed again, as all we do is another climate survey, another committee, and we're back to the racist status quo, and the cycle of racial battle fatigue continues. I know that sets you up, I think, to start talking about microaggressions.
It does. You mentioned implicit or microaggressions, and I think this last piece we can move through pretty quickly, that on the individual level, a lack of awareness about your own implicit bias and microaggressions are going to produce more racial battle fatigue. And so implicit bias, obviously, we may all have implicit bias, and it is experienced differently when supported by a system. And so when people are walking around incompetent about having awareness to identity, awareness to that list that you highlighted around how people show up in meetings, microaggressions are happening all the time. And so Dr. Sue around, came up with a wonderful definition, he and his graduate students, and talk a lot about this, of it's the small slights that happen, and it creates that cumulative impact that just constantly wears on people. And so, it shows up in a variety of ways, and these definitions are in, you again can review the PowerPoint, but insults and invalidations and all of the ways in which people are told on a regular basis that they don't matter, that they are second-class citizens, that their thoughts, their ways of being, their very being itself does not belong in a space. They're constantly othered, that there is an assumption about inferiority, and this is the implicit bias stuff, because I am quite sure, and I have worked with a number of white people who would be very clear that they say, Tanya, I so respect you, and respect you as a black woman, and then turn around in a meeting and say something that is a microaggression, or treat me in a way that is a microaggression. I was just up in Western Massachusetts this past weekend, and this is one of those things that I'm like, this is the tricky stuff that we don't notice. That every other house, it seemed, had a Black Lives Matters sign in their, stuck in their front lawn to show that people really support Black Lives Matter, and yet conversation might say that, we don't want to go down to Holyoke, which is a neighboring town, because it's too dangerous, and Holyoke has more people of color and multiracial folks. And so it's that lack of meeting between your espoused values and that belief that you're carrying around that is old, that you've been socialized into, that shows up as microaggressions. And so, denying that you have any domination or racism or racist perspectives that live in your mind or in your life or ways that you act, believing that, we live in a meritocracy and people get what they actually have earned and deserve. All of those things are common themes of microaggressions. Kathy, do you have others that you might want to share?
Kind of like you, how much time we have. There's just so many lists. One that was sticking out to me yesterday is I hear so many staff, faculty, students say they're on campus and someone, well, first of all, if they're a person of color, particularly medium dark skin, someone will say, can you help me empty this trash? I mean, assuming that they work for custodial or maintenance. I've had students, staff, faculty who have Asian American, Pacific Islander heritage, folks coming up, well, where are you from? And they're like, Chicago. No, where are you really from? Many folks across racial identity, skin color, when whites will talk to them, they're like, oh, you work here. So not even assuming you belong. So that's the umbrella. And another small quick one is every campus I get to, I hear the story of computer labs. White students go in, they're not asked for ID. A student of color goes in, asks for an ID. And so I would not have noticed that would happen. It's like going up to I'm in hotels and the clerk looks up and asks me can they help me, and if I'm not paying attention, there's a person of color literally standing in front of me that is invisible. So the invisibility and the privileging of whites and meeting our needs has happened so much. So the skill and the next step is on our campuses to have conversation, whether it's worksheets of a list of 50 of these or just conversation about what are the microaggressions you've seen, you've experienced, you've done. Have you felt about that? Have you stepped up, particularly asking the whites, what have you done? And most whites will say, I didn't know what to say. I was afraid to make it worse. I didn't want to embarrass, and then to do some workshops and skill building around how do you recognize and respond effectively to shift these in the moment.
Yeah. And I would say, to add to that, believe people when they talk about the microaggressions that they've experienced. Because not believing someone is a microaggression that, it just layers it on. Believe people when they say that is going on, because there's a read on the world that is different, having experienced this for your life.
You're reminding me that.
So I think it's, go ahead.
Just real quick, some real traps that we whites fall into, like the perfectly logical explanation, PLEs. So when a person of color will say, this just happened, oh, no, it didn't. And because we don't want it to be racism, because we don't want to think we have racist attitudes. Maybe we don't want you to feel hurt. We try to talk you out of it, but mostly is we're trying to find any reason except race for that to have happened. I just want to own that I can still do perfectly logical explanations even today.
And I think it's important to note, and this is what we're talking about, essentially racial battle fatigue is a negative effect of microaggressions that we're creating on campuses hostile and invalidating educational and work climates. We are completely devaluing people's being and their social identity. And I want to make sure people understand the organization is losing out as a result of this. Lower work productivity. If I am moving into a space having to deal with all of the microaggressions around me, my production, my brilliance is not able to show up in its fullness, and so the organization is not getting the best of me. We're perpetuating, having people move into spaces already trying to armor themselves and prepare to survive a space, as opposed to move into a space from a place of openness. Physical health problems, that is real, that the trauma lives in our bodies. You know, people have chronic headaches. I'm quite sure that some of my hip issues are me trying to move through some of the trauma that I've had to deal with in a society that is constantly throwing racial oppression. And so all of these are negative effects of microaggressions and show up as racial battle fatigue. So we're shifting a little bit now to look primarily at how it impacts people differently. Cathy, do you want to? Actually, I think I am taking this because we go, yes, directly into talking about how racial battle fatigue impacts people of color and how they show up. And so looking specifically, and I just named this, that in order to survive, people of color and multiracial and biracial identified individuals end up having to focus on getting by and sometimes end up colluding with our own oppression in order to survive spaces that are hostile. I love this quote by Alice Walker, that the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. And I think that this is important because, and mostly because my research and interest really is around internalized subordination, internalized domination, and the ways in which we take in a system of racial oppression. I want to say that though it may not feel like it sometimes, folks of color and multiracial folks, you have power. And the system doesn't actually want us to think we have any power. We do indeed have power, and some of that power can be recovered when we look at our internalized racial subordination. And so if you have the handouts, I encourage people to spend some time looking at page 8. That really, it's not a complete list, but noticing the ways in which internalized racial subordination can show up for folks of color and multiracial folks. So it's the ways that we've taken in systems of oppression, started to believe the untruths that oppression has tried to teach us, and we start acting that out. And so that's the collusion. That's the ways in which we kind of do the things that end up supporting the system when we actually don't want to, or it is not in our best interest. And so looking at that list, I also encourage whites to take a look at that list and reflect on the feelings that come up for you, knowing that your colleagues are navigating this and having this live as a part of being in a system of oppression and being marginalized in the system of oppression. I think I want to hand it off to you, Cathy, to talk more about how, no, I think actually, I'm looking again, this is sort of a transition that there are people of color and white people and multiracial folks who are living their lives and doing the work of being change agents. And so what might you recommend they do to reflect more on how they can impact the system?
I want to get to that, but can I first talk about how I'm feeling in the moment?
Sure.
Because I'm looking at the list as you're talking, and you're, challenging the whites who are on the webinar to do that. And when I see self-hatred and shame and feeling of failure, my gut is screaming. Because here's what I know, is I have worked with colleagues of color who, in my opinion, I judged as underperforming, and there I thought they weren't competent. And so I was replicating the racist white supremacist messages I got. because I did not understand that the surviving of racist oppression results in all this internalized racism, and some days it's hard to show up. Is this making sense? It's kind of a new thing I haven't said.
Oh, yeah, totally.
And so I just wanted for whites on the call to see the link between I have judged folks of color as not as competent because I'm not understanding that the organizational systems level, all they're carrying, the luggage, the baggage, and that I'm free of, so I just get to show up in a good mood. And that's one of the costs to whites, because if we're not paying attention, we will be rethinking, recycling racist attitudes. We will not have relationships with folks of color. We won't have relationships with white allies. And to be honest, if we're not growing in racial justice work and competencies, we're probably doing pretty mediocre performance. I'm not saying we may not be good in some things, but if we're not able to serve all students, all staff and faculty, to support their graduation, to support their retention, if we're not able to do that, then we're not developing the capacities that other campuses, or if we want to stay on where we are, the promotion is going to need. So we're really undermining our own capacity to move into further leadership. And so I think whites need to find some self-interest. Now, this feels actually awkward to say, but I find my experience for decades is people in privileged groups, in this case whites, will not give up white privilege, will not use their white privilege to work for racial justice until they see a compelling reason to do it. And if it's only that patronizing, let me help people of color, then as soon as they see a little change, they'll go back to just supporting racist dynamics. So I think it's critical, even if it feels awkward and yucky, to help whites see what's their self-interest. I know that many whites don't feel competent. In white caucuses, they'll finally get honest with me and say, I feel ashamed, I feel guilt, I'm colluding, I'm disappointed in myself, I'm anxious to speak up, I'm walking on eggshells, and so I'm not authentic in the workplace. All of these are cost to whites. And so we're not showing up performing effectively. And so we don't have the services, we're not partnering to create student success in the way we could. And so what do you do? Because that was your question. If people want to look at pages 18 and 19, this is just one other tool to help whites recognize the daily microaggressions, the racist attitudes and behaviors that we perpetuate out of what Tanya was talking about, that internalized dominance, when we unconsciously or consciously believe that implicit racist bias that whites are smarter, better. And so these are the dynamics that, again, it's not a complete list, but it's not bad. And so to ask whites and people with white skin privilege who might identify as multiracial or biracial to look at how do they collude and perpetuate. And this is pretty moderate to advanced work. But when whites will get honest and say, here's what I've seen other whites do in our organization, and then here's what I've done, and to really begin to form a community of whites that can get honest with each other, teach each other, nudge each other, support each other, so we're not looking to people of color to teach us or do all the work, that's how you can develop some white allyship and dismantle some of these consequences of racial battle fatigue for us. Because if we aren't able to show up as partners with folks of color who are also emotionally, physically healthy, then our systems aren't supporting us and not supporting our students, and we're just not able to look in the mirror with integrity and feel what we're doing our jobs.
And I want to offer, thank you, Cathy, for saying that and for providing this list. I want to offer, I had a chance to do a keynote on Sunday for a conference, and someone asked the question, you know, I have white colleagues who identify as allies, and they are struggling with how and when to take the risk to, you know, interrupt things. I want to offer that if whites are wanting to name themselves, or actually, we should forget about trying to name anybody ally, but the behavior makes the difference. And so forget about the calling yourself an ally and just show up. I talked about, you know, having white people look up the definition of courage in the dictionary and just behave like that. Being able to engage. So I want to offer this to folks of color. This is the power. Alice Walker talks about us giving away our power. The power that we can show up with is to engage the individual white people that you are working around who want to show up as allies, who say that they are allies. Engage them in these conversations. These common patterns, if you are seeing folks practicing this and doing it on a regular basis, a way to show up authentically in this work is to say, so you want to be an ally, I saw you do this. Let's have a conversation about why that doesn't work. And I know that that is additional labor, and white people have got to move from a place of courage to match the courage that is already showing up from people of color and multiracial and biracial folks.
So powerful. Thank you. And you reminded me that I was not able, and whites I don't think are able to show up in courage and really honor the leadership of folks of color until we've looked at our own behaviors and those around us and learned how to interrupt. I'm remembering a story of one white leader that after, I believe it was when those 3 students who were Muslim down in North Carolina, if I have the story right, were murdered, assassinated. She went in the next day to her office. She had 2 different folks identified as Muslim on her staff, and some people listening might say, why are we talking about Islam when we're talking about racism? Well, Islamophobia has been so racialized. So, and these happened to be 2 folks of color that were Muslim, and so she went to each one. And she later told me, I didn't feel comfortable. I was walking on eggshells, but with integrity, I could not go to work without going to each one and just saying, how are you doing? I'm not sure I know what to say, but I am overwhelmed and outraged and disgusted. And my guess is you're feeling fear for yourself and your family. And this is just one example of Islamophobia and murder that happens, but I just wanted to check in. And deep conversation, and then did similar things with another killing of another person of color by police, and went in. She had 4 black men that worked in her staff, and went into each one of them. And then the staff meeting that day, and at some point one of the staff of color said, thank you so much. We feel very supported. Can we move on because there's some tasks we got to get done?
Yep.
And so I don't know the right answer, but showing up as a human being with courage and love and compassion. But it's hard as whites to do that if we're scared of being called racist or we're going to do something racist. We have to do our own work.
Yes.
Anything more you want to add before I move on to this next piece?
I just want to reiterate, and I think you just named it, that oppression and oppression dynamics is stealing all of our humanity away from us, and we've got to really fight to maintain it. And just the example that you gave is an example of that.
Now we're going to talk about the consequences of the organization, because I believe most whites I've worked with think that racial battle fatigue is really only about supporting people of color and how can we help you. Again, now that kind of paternalistic place. Racial battle fatigue and racism has incredible consequences for the organization, and when senior leaders and mid-level management leaders realize this, they might find a compelling reason why they need to change their behavior. I want people to change because of their humanity, and after 30, 35 years of doing this work, I don't find a lot of people changing for those reasons. So I'm a practical person, and so whether it's the financial cost of the revolving door of how many students of color are leaving and not completing, and the achievement gap persisting, so your state or national stats are not looking good, and that impacts your reputation, which is harder to recruit and retain students of color, and some white students, because some white students now are saying, I don't want to go to a campus that's racist. And then it's with a bad or racist reputation, let me be clear, with a reputation that says you're monocultural and it's difficult to survive here if you're a person of color because of racism. Then it's going to be harder to hire people of color, multiracial, biracial folk, whites who have the competencies that are critical if you really want to do the significant change that happens. And so you're going to have status quo, racist dynamics, low morale. That's going to be unproductive conflict is going to happen more, and people won't have the skills to have the honest conversation when they're triggered in difficult dialogue. It's going to be underperforming teams, and that's all just going to keep snowballing. Higher turnover, that impacts your finances. In these times of financial crises, can you afford to hire one more mid to senior level person or one more faculty member, chair, of color who left. See, some folks that I get to say, our numbers have stayed pretty similar around staff and faculty of color, and they kind of increased. I said, well, let's look at the 5-year retention. And they kind of look at me. And when we look at those 5 and 10-year numbers, the whites might stay 5 and 10 years, but the folks of color, revolving door. And it's incredibly distracting and demoralizing, as well as financially incredibly expensive. My guess is you have some to add here, too.
Yeah, I think organizations really, just what you're saying, there should be no reason. When you were talking, I was thinking, wow, what would it be like? Almost every role that I left in higher education was about climate and culture. And what would it have been like for me to find a space where I felt like I could fully thrive and bring all of myself and show up and feel like I was growing and not being stagnant because I had to hold all of this work. And so I love that you make the connection that organizations are, I don't think people realize that I don't like the language of the business case for diversity or the business case for social justice, but if that's what transforms folks, organizations need to look at how they're losing out.
On so many levels.
Yeah.
And so my guess is people listening realize these are some of the next steps, is to bring people together to have these conversations, and a couple tools to do that. Many of our, when we're working together, Tanya, we'll have people think about this continuum scale 0 to 10. How welcoming, inclusive, and supportive is the current campus climate culture success for everybody, and in this case, particularly across race. And have people sit with that a moment, maybe journal for reflective learners, which I forget to do, and then literally go move into a continuum. We usually do a horseshoe so people can still see each other, and 0 to 10, and then have people scan or pan, pay attention and notice by group membership who's where. And people can guess that there are more people of color in the lower numbers and more whites in the higher numbers. There are more folks in low to mid-level, lower numbers, more higher ranking folks in the higher. And then talk about why you chose that number and sit down and have a facilitated, authentic conversation. That could be one step that could get people talking and getting honest. And then it's, well, what's causing that? But you've got to get people really getting honest. Another way to do that, again, I only think in continuum, but to ask, how competent are our leaders, faculty, and staff to truly create the environments to support the success? Because what happens, and this is my fear when people hear the term racial battle fatigue, it's talked about as in stress and mental health issues and physical health, is they'll think, well, students of color just worked harder if the faculty just got their lives together, as opposed to it's the staff, faculty, it's the climate, the policies, the practices that are set up to privilege whites and to disadvantage people of color. And until people recognize that and believe it, then we'll still be stuck at the individual level and blaming people. So this conversation really helps people realize, oh, it's our competence that is what's lacking here. And this may then help them move into this conversation, which I alluded to earlier. This is that same Jackson Hardiman MCOD, multicultural organizational model. You can do the same thing once people learn the model. And there's some very quick, I think, interactive ways to help people learn enough, and then do a continuum. People are hearing a pattern on the phone here. And when I do this, and I know we've done these together, it's fascinating to watch. People are saying it is dangerous and hostile and exclusionary here to be a person of color. And then there are usually a few, but then a lot of folks are in clubs saying it's not as overt as it used to be, but we feel we cannot speak up. We have to fit in. There is clearly a club and a monocultural environment. And so the honest dialogue that can happen when you bring top leaders, middle-level leaders, and lots of folks of color across leadership, because most campuses I get to, there aren't many people of color in senior, much less middle management. And then you might even get students in the room to have a real conversation. Where do you think we are and why? And it has to be expertly facilitated because folks, unless they've done their work on race. So these are 3 different skills and tools to get more honest conversation, to hear the stories of what it's like to get up every day and come to work when in a club or a compliance organization where you're just following the rules and doing what the legal says you have to do. And then from that, there are all sorts of conversations to have. Well, how do we move from one stage to another? And that's when we need to develop competency-based systems, look at our hiring, how we do supervision, how we're holding people accountable, especially whites in their development, how we're doing training, all the first responders, library tutors, advisors, counselors, health providers, RAs, all the faculty, and then deans, associate deans, chairs, mid-level managers, and staff, anybody in faculty development, developing the capacities to analyze whatever your sphere of influence is, where are unintended racist microaggressions, where are unintended practices, policies, curriculum that privileges whiteness or replicates racist dynamics, and to be able to interrupt those.
Mm-hmm. And I think
particularly, oh, I'm sorry, please go.
Well, I just am thinking, I think it's implicit in everything that you're saying is that it's about moving to action, and that it's not something that we can think about for too long, that it's going to be handled overnight, but it is consistent actions. And so what are your priorities? What are the organization's priorities? How can you impact systems, and how can you individually show up as well? I'm going to take us to our 30-second stretch. I don't want to move without you, Cathy. Is that all right?
Let's do it. I'm stretching.
All right. So we encourage everybody to get up, take a few seconds to really just stretch it out, and we'll be right back. So we are back, and I think that this is a neat slide for us to acknowledge that we're moving to the next steps. We want to make sure that we provide some time for questions, and so we're going to move through this part a little quicker. But we want to acknowledge, and Cathy, you said this, that basically we can't keep doing the same thing. Old ways won't open new doors, and so we want to have you think about and reflect on some helpful next steps in supporting people of color and multiracial folks on your campus. It's important to support opportunities for people of color and multiracial and biracial folks to experience healing. I've had the opportunity to go to a couple of organizations lately that have created of color spaces and have put money towards affinity group work to do healing for people of color. And I highlight that because a traditional inclusion workshop really is usually focused on white people raising their competency. And it's a completely different work that folks of color and multiracial folks have to do around healing from the trauma that they face on a regular basis. And so for institutions to put time, to put funds, put energy, to create space for that to happen is a way to really support folks of color and multiracial folks on campus. And then create spaces that allow for authentic voice. And so, again, with the idea of believing people when they say what is happening in a work environment. Really allowing for voice to live. So one, creating a safer space, and let's be honest, there is no completely safe space, but a safer space that people won't be challenged on a constant basis or fear having to lose their role or lose opportunity if they say something about the climate and culture and organization of what's going on. And for folks of color, I think it's important to recognize that we don't have to be afraid of the truth and afraid of our truth. And it is our responsibility and within our power to really show up whole, that I don't have to actually leave pieces of me behind in order to make people comfortable. It is a gift to have sacred healing spaces, and it is okay to take that space. It is absolutely okay to take that space. And if you are on a campus that's like, I don't feel safe, Tanya, in doing that, take it little at a time, and don't do it alone. But the healing space, the sacred healing spaces, are super important. I think it's important also to talk about liberation, and this definition comes from Dr. Barbara Love, who has it's a consciousness, liberatory consciousness that we can reflect on. But I just want to highlight that she talks about liberation as really people being able to access and have their whole full humanness promoted. And so if people are talking about wanting to create liberatory spaces on campus, if that language has permeated your workspace and it's been the new jargon, actually demand that your full humanness gets promoted and gets to show up. I love the language of empowered person of color and multiracial or biracial person, that there is a way to show up in those spaces strategically, but also with self-affirmation. And I feel like I've seen that more and more in spaces. And how do we begin to do that together in community with each other and heal as a part of this, as a part of the racist society that we live in? It's about having pride in oneself, one social group, the social group at large in collaboration and community, and understanding racism as systemic and holding that to be true, that it is not, you are not the problem. It is the system that is the problem. And then asserting your rights in strategic and persistent ways. Audre Lorde shares with us that caring for myself is not self-indulgent, but it is about self-preservation, that I get to care for myself in the process, and that is an act of activism as well. And I would add to that, seeking our own joy. That is an act of activism as well, that I have a right to joy in this life and in this workspace and in my ways of being. We all know that we're carrying around the weight, and we don't actually, because we have normalized it, the fatigue has been so normalized. I want to name that it is okay, and I would imagine Cathy is joining me in this space, that it is up to us to release the normalization of fatigue and own and stand in our not only rightful place, but the space that is ours every day. And then lastly, we are teaching people how to treat ourselves all the time. And so show up on a campus, very clear that that's not how, and not how you want to be treated, not how, and you can show up in spaces with from a place of love and liberation and still not stand for the racism and in fact, I think liberation allows for you to show up in power and still tell people, like, this racism is not okay, and I'm going to show up, and I'm going to expect you to show up differently. I think the shift that we want to make is, Cathy mentioned accelerating folks who do the change agent work. There are people of color on campus, and I, having served as directors of diversity and inclusion and chief diversity officer, really raising the capacity of people of color who are change agents in those roles. I know that you live in a very tenuous spot in the middle. There are places that you can push, not only for yourself, but for your colleagues as well. And so in the resources, there is a self-assessment for inclusion practitioners. that can be used for folks of color who are in those roles, but also white folks who are in those roles, to really reflect on ways that, with that unique middle spot of having the power to talk about these issues, but then advocate for yourself and your of color and biracial and multiracial colleagues, but also challenge people from that position, your white colleagues, and really pushing on that. And so taking a look at that, I think, is super important. So Cathy, do you want to talk about building capacity among white change agents?
Always. Because that same document, whites can use that to look at their own capacity. To be honest, I'd share it with some whites and colleagues of color and ask them to rate you, because you might, my experiences in the Social Justice Training Institute and other places, we whites tend to overrate our competencies and capacity, and when our colleagues get honest with us, we're like, yeah, not so much. So, but it can be a great way to look at what are the capacities that you have and what do you want to develop. But I want to suggest we get to the systems level on this, because I think these capacities should be basic, foundational, expected requirements for every single person in any kind of supervision or leadership or faculty level. And I almost said any staff member. So I just want to, I haven't thought that far, but I still would. But we often don't pay folks very much money to deepen their professional, you know what I'm saying? But I think every single person needs to have these capacities. So how are we infusing these competencies into job descriptions, interview questions, our hiring practices, performance management? And so this tool can be used many different ways. And I know there are other competency tools, and this one's not perfect, but it's not bad. But to think really creatively, how can you use it systemically to raise the bar on what you expect people now? I know supervisors have taken this, had people they work with, all their direct reports take it. They've come together, talked about it, and then collaboratively said, so as a team, what professional development do we want for the next 6 months to help rise all of us so we can better serve students, develop practices, policies that get rid of the implicit racism. And this will help accelerate the change agents development. So I like the idea of also having a cadre of change agents, whether they're in formal positions or you develop more inclusion practitioners. There's some colleges I work with that have one per unit, one per department, if not 2 or 3, people who get extra training and support, year-long development, and they're expected to go back and partner with senior leaders to really develop culture change. If we're looking at the individual level, I want to suggest that some of the changes we can make in professional development is help people think about what does it mean to be an ally and really show up in competence. And then what are the strategies to do that? And so whether it's caucus work, as you mentioned, book club at the end, the book I wrote earlier this year, But I'm Not Racist, Tools for Well-Meaning Whites. You can download a PDF from my website for free, and many campuses are right now doing book clubs, and several of them, they work in the communities as well. So just try to get whites to understand many of these dynamics we're talking about in ways that can be helpful. There's another document, page 35 to 42. I realize it's the longest one, I think. But in that book, I talk about what are the competencies that I think white allies, change agents, and when I use that language, I mean every single person on every campus who has any responsibility for supervision, team leading, faculty training, needs these competencies so that they understand white supremacy, racism, how it plays out, how to engage other whites effectively. Instead of calling us out and judgment and blame, how do you work with other whites to grow and develop? That's critical in our role so that the burden for doing all this work is not with people of color. We step up and do our part. And there's a lot of resources in that book around our own self-healing, around those internalized racist messages we were taught and perpetuate. We have to unlearn those so that we can show up and not say racist things and stay quiet when empowered folks of color are speaking truth to power and other whites are critiquing, judging, blaming, retaliating. We need to have the courage to speak up and say, oh no, all right, that's not how we enter, that's the energy with which, but I don't say, oh no, but to say, can we slow down and take a look at this? Because I actually agree with what they're saying, and we need to look. So how do you use your white privilege to speak up and partner with folks of color, especially when empowered folks of color are speaking up and trying to create change instead of staying quiet, silent, fight, flight, freeze? We, working with whites, have to be truthful, gentle, and fearless with each other. And when we work to do organizational change, we have to be fearless, gentle, and truthful. Mahatma Gandhi.
So, thinking about organizational leadership and preparation, there are clear ways that organizations can address and eliminate microaggressions. And these, I think, are more individual, but again, connected to what Cathy was saying, you know, what does it mean for an organization to look deeply at this as a group, so that we can start, you know, interrupting them with each other and deeply transforming the culture, and therefore then being able to look in the ways that our policies and practices are supporting spaces that are not helpful. And again, addressing implicit bias, some of the same connections, that implicit bias, because it shows up individually, it ends up happening in the system and in through the organizational policies and practices. And so being able to do that work and have that as a norm, a consistent norm, it's, again, not a one-time thing, that a consistent norm that the organization, the individuals in the organization are willing to take a look. I want to share this resource from Robert Gass, that he's developed a wonderful organizational model for change that we can't just look in one area. A lot of the work that ends up getting done, organizations call in consultants like Cathy and I, and they really want to work the hearts and minds. But it really is about the system. How do we change the system and behaviors connected to those systems? And so that you have to actually work all of them and recognize that society is constantly pushing at us. And so that's the true system that is going on, and it's got to be, though all of these areas have to be encompassed in the work. I love this slide, that if you want something in your life that you've never had, you have to do something different. And so again, when organizations and people say, well, what do I have to do? It's like, well, you got to do something different. You're not going to get anything to change if you keep doing the same thing. The secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but building the new. And that is a liberatory perspective, that we look so much at looking behind us sometimes and fighting, you know, even what is in the present, and don't even focus on what we actually want in the future and having a vision for something being able to be different. And so we encourage that as you do this work. And this connected back to Dr. Barbara Love, that a liberatory consciousness is really about having awareness and living with intentionality as we do this system, as we do this work in a larger system and try to move through. And the last few slides really are just to help us recognize that we are, I believe that everyone truly is, I agree with this quote, that everyone is doing their best from their level of consciousness, and it is also up to us as individuals and the system or the organization to help people raise their consciousness level. So lastly, practicing self-care as you engage in this work, and that is for everyone, all identities, that self-care is needed as we do this work. We've got to sustain. Cathy has a book coming out very soon that talks about really being able to be sustainable in our change work, because this is not a sprint, but a marathon, and really being able to move through it for the long haul. Because you can't pour from an empty cup, I can't give what I don't already have. And so where's the work that I need to do? Where are the places where I need to refill myself and constantly refill so that I can keep giving? And I love this last quote, that our work is large, but we don't have to be daunted by it. There's a lot of grief. We can do justly now. We can love mercy now, and we can walk humbly now. And it's not up to us to see the final picture, I will say that we have to have a vision for it, though. And it's not within our right to just say, I want to throw my hands up. We can't, it's not up to us to actually throw our hands up and be free to abandon it. I want to hand it back over to Cathy to say a few words about her book, and then I think we're going to open up for some questions.
So my hope is that people are going to type in a couple questions because I don't see any right now. So kind of take a moment, and really what this slide is for you to get the link if you want to download But I'm Not Racist, Tools for Writing Whites as a resource. And I've had many folks of color come up to me and say, I've read this and found it helpful to understand more the dynamics of racism, to realize, as Tanya said earlier, it's not about me, I'm not incompetent. It's a system of racism that's set up to privilege whites, disadvantaged people of color. So that could be a wonderful, easy, free next step as you are moving to have whites increase their capacity to partner with folks of color, follow the leadership of folks of color. Ooh, we got a question. What are some examples of racist policies at colleges and universities?
Cathy, before we do that, let me just jump in real quick and remind folks that we would love, of course, for you to write in with questions. All you have to do is use the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen to type in your question or comment, and we'll see it. All right, sorry about that, Cathy. The question here is, what are some examples of racist policies at colleges and universities?
I think if I can kind of answer that first, and Cathy, you can add. What I experience is that because we know that we live in a society that racism is actually illegal, it doesn't show up as much in policies as it shows up in practices. And that policies are meant to kind of write the racism out, but people's implicit bias, their own belief systems, their own everyday practices end up bringing the practice and the cultural norms into it. What would you add, Cathy?
I agree that it can be harder to find explicit laws and policies that are racist unless we really kind of look at some. So quickly, I've heard of housing policies in residence halls that still, when you apply to college and you put down a deposit, then you're allowed to choose your housing. And I believe most of the research still shows that some of the first people to put down a housing deposit are folks that have come from private schools as well as well-financed public schools where there's lots of counseling and support. And so the race intersection with class and first gen to college often impacts who then gets, and usually the first residence halls that get learning communities. So there's some privileging there, if that makes sense. And so at some of those intersections, we have to have some more complicated. Even having the policy that you have to have a certain SAT score in order to get into certain things, as opposed to demonstrated capacity and competence. You have to know that those tests are so racially biased. And one final one, hiring, having a certain credentials or preferencing people who come from certain schools, Harvard, Yale, the racist dynamics that perpetuate who gets to go to what school. So sometimes you might have to go to a second or third level to see the pipeline and how racism impacts. But I love the question. We could just talk about so many hiring practices that have racist dynamics played into them, like where are you advertising, and who do you even invite onto your search committee, and how promotion and tenure, oh my gosh, how many times in a promotion tenure meeting does someone say, and again, this is a practice, not necessarily policy, but their policy might be you have to publish in tier 1 journals, but tier 1 journals may not take some of the research that some folks of color do that is challenging racist systems, and so they don't meet the racist criteria that you only get promotion tenure if you have books that are published in these publishing areas, publishing companies, which their practices are to privilege whites. So I'll stop there, but those are just several that come to mind.
And I really like your point about the intersection. And so Matthew, who I saw wrote the question actually might be because we're talking about how policy is, it's not written to be racist. The question might be, where are policies that are classist? Because you probably are going to find some racial spins to it. And so really engaging that question and understanding how classism plays itself out on campuses, I think, is highly important.
I'm going to move us to our next question, which is, how can a person of color begin overcoming student evaluations that are negative?
Ooh, that is a large question. And the way that I'm going to interpret it is that the institution is reading negative evaluations by students about a person of color who, might have spoken up or is more outspoken, and therefore they're not happy with the class. And, for me, that is when allied behavior, can really show up. That what about white allies and partnering with other faculty members who, might in some ways have your back, or really questioning the ways that evaluations play into people's teaching or tenure files, and really asking the question. It feels like a larger question.
All I want to add, because I know we're running short of time, is use the research. There's lots of research out there that shows racial bias, and so use it.
Yeah.
Our next question here, as a person of color, how do you have the conversation about racial fatigue?
It's, again, finding those safe spaces to express the truth of what is going on for you on a regular basis. And, really, I think, engaging the conversation sometimes with other people of color in affinity space, and then moving from that space in community and collaboration to places that might, if it's a predominantly white space and there are more white people in middle management and upper management, moving from a space of affinity to say this is a norm across the experience. And so that is a way to start.
The only thing I'd add is sometimes you might need to do that in organized trainings and or some surveys to collect up examples, because some folks in leadership, particularly whites, data is important, and data means real stuff for our campus. So you can start by collecting up examples from some of your other colleagues if your campus isn't ready to collect it, and just say, here's some things happening on campuses. I wonder if they're happening here. And the debrief questions, actually, I think the first one is, how do you think racial battle fatigue is showing up on our campus? Even that question after this, you might get all kinds of examples that if people give you permission to make generic examples, you could, if you had 20 or 30 examples from folks of color of what it feels like, those stories bring other voices in the room and might create some safety.
Looks like we have time for one last question. How do we engage more senior leadership in these discussions?
I really think that it's, and I won't say that all senior leadership needs to understand the business impact or the impact on the organization, but I think really helping people get that this impacts the way that the institution is seen and felt, and I don't want to have senior leadership seen or understood as only worried about the bottom line. But I think appealing to heart and mind, but also the reality of the impact that this has on faculty and staff and students and more largely the institution.
And what is in their self-interest, and how do they like the information that they'll then act on? So if they like data, surveys, focus group data. And I want to believe, joining you, Tanya, that most people are good-hearted people. And so I have this image of some person of color who can just have a sit-down over lunch or a beverage or a walk and just say to the leader, can we just talk about what's going on campus, that because you're so busy doing things you may not know, let me just tell you some of the stories that I'm hearing. And of course they have to be generic, but just literally, quote, put a face on it. And I think most folks, their hearts will open, and then they might be willing to do the behavior change and the systems change in that model. But this is not easy work. It's 2017, and we're still talking about these issues, and the dynamics of racism, I think, are increasing since November. So, but we got to do the hard work.
Yes.
Thank you to you.
So,
would you be willing to share the 5 takeaways from today?
Sure thing. So obviously we've talked very clearly about how racial battle fatigue is severely and negatively impacting the folks of color and multiracial and biracial folks on campus. That we've named story after story after story that how that shows up, and I'm sure people on campuses can share that as well.
And whites, not only we have to deepen our own capacity and get other whites too, but I think it is critical that leaders take the lead and create the space for those healing spaces, not wait to be asked, and mostly create those accountability structures, competency-based and accountability, so that all people are expected and required to do the work that we're hired there to do and not put it all on the burden of folks of color to serve students of color. It's just outrageous in these times.
And administrators, staff, faculty, have to, across all races, have to collaborate, this is not an individual fix. It has to be done in collaboration and in community to shift the organizational culture, climate, and practices. That we have to, it's the intersection, and this is why I love organizational work, is that the individual has impact on the organization and the organization has impact on the individual. And so they are both working at the same time, and we've got to be able to see that this work is only going to change when we put those two things together.
And we have to have a balanced approach. As Tanya talks so powerfully about liberation, we have to have the vision and talk and come from a liberation perspective, while we also have space to talk about the causes of racial battle fatigue, the impact. White culture would have us want to move into quick fixes. We have to have space for people to say, this is what's going on, here's the impact, here's how it feels. But if we only stay focused on what's hard and what's just so challenging and racism, if we don't also have a liberation model, then we'll just be depleted in our energy. We won't have the strength and vision to also balance that and move and take action.
And it is important to create accountability structures. How are we expecting competency from people, and how are we building that into conversations and evaluation so that we can really get that meaningful and sustainable change? I often hear people say that I can't believe it's 2017 and we're still talking about this. Until we actually build it into accountability structures and ways in which the organization is holding people accountable to make these changes, we will keep saying that year after year after year. We actually have to really work towards meaningful and sustainable change. And I just want to add, I saw some of the fantastic questions on the side. Please reach out. We'd love to engage and have further conversation with folks, and so please do that.
Thank you so much to everyone again for attending today. Please consider joining our Facebook and Twitter communities to be a part of our national conversations about higher education. Just as Tanya just said, for those listeners who are unable to ask a question in our allotted time, please feel free to email any questions or feedback that you have to info@paper-clip.com or directly to Tanya or Cathy, because they both included their email addresses, and they will be able to respond to you or engage with you. Please also note the details about how to receive a certificate of completion for today's webinar and some of our upcoming webinars on the last couple of slides. To receive your certificate of completion, you will need the same username and password that you used to download your webinar materials for today. You also will receive a CD recording of today's event. That does conclude today's Paperclip Communications webcast. I would like to once again very much thank both Tanya and Cathy for sharing with us on this important topic. And on behalf of Paperclip Communications, thank you to our audience for joining us today. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon.